Baik, sebelum kita berhenti rehat, kita ikuti rakaman temu bual Nina Rozman susulan laporan Bank Dunia sebelum ini. Jadi silakan.
Alright, the World Bank just launched its latest report with the theme Informal Employment in Malaysia, looking at trends, challenges and opportunities to reform. And the report and policy briefs aims to fill the knowledge gap about informal employment in Malaysia and how suggested policies and to better protect, enhance the productivity of the workers in the sector. And we have our guests to discuss a bit further about this report. We have here is Dr. Yashodhan Gorpada, the Senior Economist at World Bank. I want to say thank you very much for joining me. Congratulations on the latest report. Maybe you can share with us maybe some of the key takeaways from this report.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. Now, informal employment in Malaysia is something that is of much concern to all members of society and for policy because informal employment, if we understand it as basically employment which does not have standard protections that many of us have in our regular jobs, jobs that don't necessarily have pension contributions or protection against risks. This is something that is of concern in Malaysia because while some types of informal employment, such as farmers and street vendors and hawkers, those numbers over time have been going down, and we see that quite clearly. Other types of informal employment, especially in the gig economy and through digital platforms, those are beginning to rise. And then this raises a question about are workers in informal employment, do they have enough protection or are they sufficiently productive? These are questions we delve into the report. And we find that while informal employment overall is declining, there are still important gaps to be filled. Protection needs of workers need to be met because informal workers are exposed to many different types of risks. And we mention a few policy recommendations for how these risks can be mitigated.
Talking about the informal employments, maybe you want to check on what are the specific or certain challenges faced by informal workers in terms of access to social protection and even labor rights.
So absolutely. Now, informal workers are typically out of the fold of social protection programs. They do not have EPF or SOCSO contributions for the most part. Some of them may do, but not enough coverage. And this contrast this with the fact that they actually face many different kinds of risks and shocks. So their incomes are not very stable. They don't have a fixed monthly salary that many of us otherwise may have. Their incomes are very volatile. They face lots of risks of injuries and of health-related issues. So there is certainly a gap between the vulnerabilities they face on the one hand and the lack of access to social protection for them.
Definitely talking about to strengthen the protection for the informal workers and to enhance their productivity, we need to know what kind of impact this informal employment bring to the country. So how does informal employment impact the overall economy and the well-being of Malaysia?
So in our analysis, we found that the informally employed workers actually tend to earn much lesser than formally employed workers, even if they have the same education, the same age, same gender, same location, same industry. So being informally employed actually means on average workers are paid lesser. Their work does not bring them as much money as they would in a formal job. They also don't have enough protection against the kinds of risks they face in their work. So from a social point of view also, this is also quite concerning because we're talking about large numbers of people whose income is very volatile, it's generally low, and they also face risks around health, around insufficient incomes, around the variability of incomes. So it's certainly a concern for the economy.
Within the reports, we can also see the recommendations for the policy for the informal worker, and we want to see what are the current initiative or policies that have been implemented to address to the informal employment in Malaysia, and maybe share some what the outcomes have been.
Right. So certainly agencies such as SOXO and DPF have particularly launched specific programs for supporting the informally employed. The ISARAN is one such program which allows voluntary contributions for social insurance coverage. This is something that's certainly seen with a lot of interest, not just for us in Malaysia, but also it's an interesting case study abroad. But the challenge here is to try and evaluate some of these initiatives a little more carefully so we can learn a little bit more about them. But we certainly feel that some of the initiatives around voluntary contributions, which is a big challenge, but allowing voluntary contributions for EPF and SOXO coverage is a very welcome policy initiative undertaken by the government. That said, our report also shows that although these initiatives have been launched, their take-up remains somewhat low. So, they're welcome initiatives, but we need to understand why not all workers are still able to access them, and going the last mile and reaching the majority of workers remains a challenge.
And talking about other challenges, how does informal worker intersect with other socioeconomic issues like poverty, gender inequality, and rural-urban disparities?
No, certainly there's a lot of analysis that we did around these questions. So we cannot, in fact, take away the issue of informal employment from these other structural issues that we mentioned. So in our analysis, for instance, we find that older workers are generally more likely to be in informal employment as a whole. So there is an age dimension to this, but there is also a poverty dimension, because we find that the rates of participation in informal employment is much higher among poorer households. So it is very closely linked to poverty status. A large number of the informally employed are in fact poor. So we have to really take more of this granular analysis. I can go on about some of these details. We also find, since you mentioned gender, for instance, that women in informal employment are paid on average much lesser than men who are also in informal employment. So the wage gap by gender in informal employment is also a matter of concern. We explore these and other aspects that you mentioned, differences by rural-urban location and so on, and there's a lot more information in our report on precisely these questions.
Definitely, there's a lot more to look at other of this aspect, and we want to talk about going not only to protect the globalizations, technological advancement like AI. We know that impact. How does this impact the dynamics of informal employment in Malaysia?
Well, that's a very good question, and there's no straightforward answer to it, because on the one hand, we could think of different types of technological developments, AI and others, also replacing the need for informal employment. At the same time, these technological advancements can actually make it easier for us to be able to extend the reach of social protection programs to the informally employed. It's also possible that those who are informally employed can even benefit from some of the new emerging technologies, generative AI in particular, to improve their productivity on their jobs. So a lot depends, on very specifically what the technologies are used for. But of course, we have to wait to see what exactly will be the effects. But we can estimate, we can expect, both positive and negative effects.
And what can also we learn from other countries' experiences in tackling the informal employment, and how are they applicable in the Malaysian context?
So the Malaysian context is quite unique in many ways, but at the same time we have tried to see as much as possible the extent to which successes in other countries may be applicable in Malaysia. But if I were to just say very broad principles and not very specific policy recommendations, I think effective but limited regulation is useful. It is useful to have a wider variety of choices for social insurance coverage for the informally employed. And Malaysia is actually quite well placed to do that. And in fact, we often share some of the examples of Malaysia with other countries. But I think where certainly more can be done is on linking the social protection programs with social insurance programs to make sure that none of the informally employed workers fall between the cracks. So there is a better linkage between EPF and SOXO on the one hand, but also on the cash transfer programs on the other, so that the informally employed workers can benefit from coverage from both as needed.
All right, we're on year of 2024 and the stronger recovery phases from the pandemic COVID-19. How do you foresee the future of informal employment in Malaysia, maybe on the near term or even the long term?
So from the data that we've been looking at, there has been a secular decline in the overall rate of informal employment. We probably expect that that will continue. At the same time, some newly emerging forms of informal employment, particularly in the gig economy, would probably rise. And even in the most advanced countries, we see that there is some prevalence of informal work, particularly in the gig economy. We suspect that that will probably remain, but more than speculating on just the numbers and the trends of overall informal employment, we'd very much like to focus on the issue of the protection and productivity of the workers. That, in fact, has been central in our report. And we'd like to move a little bit away from the focus on just numbers overall for multiple reasons. And, as I mentioned, turn the focus on protection and productivity needs of those who are informally employed.
All right, we're hoping for all the policy recommendation and the current policy are able to strengthen the protection for the informal workers and also enhance their productivity. And I want to say thank you very much to our guest, Dr. Yashodan Gorpada, the Senior Economist, World Bank, and also the author of the World Bank latest report of the informal employment in Malaysia, trends, challenges, and opportunities to reform. And for those who you missed out on this discussion with the Senior Economist, Dr. Yashodan, you can see all the discussion will be featured in all astrowani.com and all our social media platform. I'm Nina Rosman. Catch you on the next.